For generations, long before the Grand Canyon became a national park, and decades before a mysterious newspaper story captured public attention, the Hopi people preserved an extraordinary tradition. They spoke of a world beneath the canyon, not a symbolic underworld or a place reached after death, but vast underground chambers where their ancestors once lived, and where mysterious beings were said to have existed long before the present world began. According to the Hopi, these beings were tall, covered in hair, and lived deep beneath the canyon. They were remembered not as monsters or legends, but as part of the oldest history passed down through the Bear clan for countless generations. Then, in April of 1909, an Arizona newspaper published a story that sounded strangely familiar. A government-sponsored explorer claimed he had discovered a hidden cave carved into the walls of the Grand Canyon. Inside were underground chambers, preserved mummies, unusual artifacts, and inscriptions unlike anything archaeologists had ever documented in North America. The story quickly spread across the country. Then it disappeared. More than a century later, one question remains. Was the newspaper describing an elaborate hoax, or had it stumbled onto the same underground world the Hopi had been describing all along? Today, we're examining the historical records, the Hopi oral traditions, and the events surrounding one of the most debated stories ever connected to the Grand Canyon. To understand why the 1909 Grand Canyon story continues to fascinate people more than a century later, we have to begin much earlier, long before explorers mapped the canyon, long before archaeologists surveyed its cliffs, and long before the Arizona Gazette published its famous article. The Hopi were already telling a story about what existed beneath the canyon. For the Hopi, this was never simply a legend. It was part of their history. Their oldest oral traditions describe humanity passing through a series of worlds before arriving in the one we know today. According to those traditions, the present world is not the first. Earlier worlds ended through great catastrophes, and each time the survivors were guided to safety before eventually emerging into a new age. That emergence is one of the foundations of Hopi belief. The place where it happened is known as the Sipapu, a sacred opening through which the ancestors entered the present world after living below the earth. Unlike many creation stories found around the world, the Hopi tradition speaks of a real place connected to the landscape of northern Arizona, not simply a symbolic heaven or spiritual realm. But what makes the tradition especially intriguing is what the ancestors were said to have encountered before that journey was complete. According to the Bear clan, whose oral history has preserved many of the oldest Hopi traditions, there were already beings living beneath the earth. The Hopi called them the ant people. Despite the name, the descriptions do not resemble ordinary ants or insects. They are remembered as intelligent beings who lived inside underground chambers and possessed knowledge of the world below the surface. During times of catastrophe, they sheltered the ancestors, protected them, and helped them survive until it was safe to emerge again. Some traditions describe them as taller than ordinary people. Others remember them as being covered in hair. And nearly all agree on one important detail. They lived beneath the canyon. For generations, these accounts were preserved through oral tradition, passed carefully from one generation to the next long before they were ever written down by anthropologists or historians. They remained part of Hopi cultural memory without any connection to newspapers, archaeology, or government expeditions. Then, in the spring of 1909, a newspaper published a story that sounded uncannily familiar. Before we continue, if you enjoy documentaries that explore forgotten history through historical records, archaeology, and indigenous traditions, consider subscribing. It helps the channel and allows me to keep researching stories like this. Because the report published in Arizona that year didn't just describe an ordinary cave. It described an underground world that seemed strangely similar to one the Hopi had been talking about for generations. On the morning of April 5, 1909, readers of the Arizona Gazette opened their newspaper to what would become one of the most controversial stories ever connected to the Grand Canyon. The headline described an extraordinary archaeological discovery. According to the article, a man named G. Kincaid, who identified himself as an explorer working on a government-sponsored expedition associated with the Smithsonian Institution, had discovered a hidden cave carved high into the walls of the Grand Canyon. The entrance, the newspaper reported, could only be reached by boat along the Colorado River because it sat hundreds of feet above the waterline on an almost vertical cliff face. What caught people's attention wasn't simply the location. It was what Kincaid claimed to have found inside. The article described a massive underground complex extending deep into the rock. A long central passage reportedly stretched for more than 1,000 feet with dozens of chambers branching off in every direction. Some rooms were said to contain carefully stored grain that had somehow remained preserved. Others held pottery, copper tools, weapons, and carved objects unlike anything archaeologists had associated with the ancient cultures of the American Southwest. Then the report became even stranger. Kincaid described discovering several mummies seated rather than laid flat, carefully wrapped and preserved inside the chambers. Nearby were statues and carved figures that, according to the article, appeared to resemble artistic styles more commonly associated with Egypt or Asia than with prehistoric North America. The walls themselves were reportedly covered with symbols and inscriptions that neither Kincaid nor the expedition's archaeologist could identify. They measured what they could, photographed portions of the site, and continued documenting the chambers over multiple visits. Only 4 days later, on April 9th, the Arizona Gazette published a second article expanding on the discovery. Rather than treating the first report as a joke or a rumor, the newspaper presented additional details about the expedition, the layout of the cave, and the remarkable collection of artifacts said to be waiting inside. To readers in 1909, the story sounded less like fiction and more like the announcement of a discovery that might completely reshape the history of the American Southwest. But then, something unusual happened. The story simply stopped. No photographs of the chambers were ever published. No artifacts appeared in museums. No scientific report followed. And the expedition that had supposedly made one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in American history seemed to vanish almost as quickly as it had appeared. That disappearance would become just as mysterious as the cave itself. As interest in the Arizona Gazette story grew, researchers began asking what seemed like the obvious question. If this expedition really happened, where were the records? The newspaper had identified the explorer as G.E. Kincaid and stated that the work was connected to the Smithsonian Institution through an archaeologist identified as Professor S. Jordan. If one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in American history had actually taken place, there should have been photographs, excavation reports, correspondence, museum records, or at the very least an official acknowledgement that the expedition had occurred. Instead, researchers found almost nothing. Over the years, historians and independent investigators searched for documentation that could confirm the expedition described in the newspaper. The Smithsonian has consistently stated that it has no record of G.E. Kincaid being employed by the institution, no record of Professor S. A. Jordan connected to the expedition, and no record of artifacts matching those described in the Arizona Gazette articles. For many historians, that was enough to dismiss the story as nothing more than an elaborate newspaper fabrication. But others argued that the situation was not quite so simple. The newspaper itself was real. The April 5th and April 9th editions unquestionably existed, and researchers have verified that both articles were genuinely published in 1909. The mystery was never whether the newspaper printed the story. The mystery was whether the events described in those articles actually occurred. That distinction is important. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, newspapers occasionally published sensational stories alongside ordinary reporting. At the same time, legitimate archaeological discoveries were also being announced through newspapers before formal scientific papers appeared. Simply appearing in print did not automatically prove a discovery, but neither did it automatically disprove one. Then researchers noticed another detail. Only 3 years before the Arizona Gazette story appeared, the Antiquities Act of 1906 had become law, giving the federal government authority over significant archaeological discoveries made on federal land. The Grand Canyon was already under federal protection, meaning that any major discovery there would have fallen under federal oversight. The Smithsonian frequently worked with government agencies on archaeological investigations during this period, making the newspaper's reference understandable within the historical context, even though no expedition records have been publicly confirmed. Decades later, researchers continued looking for additional clues. Some reported finding scattered references to a man named G.E. Kincaid in unrelated historical records, suggesting that a person by that name may have existed. Others pointed to gaps in archival collections from the period, although missing records can occur for many ordinary reasons, including incomplete preservation, cataloging errors, or simple loss over time. None of these findings by themselves confirm the Grand Canyon expedition described in 1909. So, more than a century later, the story remains suspended between two possibilities. Either the Arizona Gazette published one of the most detailed archaeological hoaxes of its time, or it reported on an expedition whose full history has never been recovered. And that uncertainty becomes even more intriguing when the newspaper's description is placed beside something that had existed long before 1909. The Hopi traditions had already been describing underground chambers and unusual beings beneath the Grand Canyon for generations, long before anyone claimed to discover a hidden chamber inside the Grand Canyon. The Hopi had already been telling a remarkably similar story. For generations, Hopi elders passed these traditions from one generation to the next through their clan system. Unlike written histories that can disappear with time, Hopi knowledge survived through continuous oral transmission, carefully preserved by elders whose responsibility was to remember and teach the history of their people. Among the oldest of these traditions is the story of the Ant People. To someone hearing the name for the first time, it sounds almost mythical, but the Hopi descriptions are far more detailed than the name suggests. The Ant People were not remembered as ordinary insects or imaginary creatures. They were described as intelligent beings who lived beneath the earth inside underground chambers. During times of great catastrophe, when earlier worlds were destroyed, these beings sheltered the ancestors of the Hopi, providing protection until it was safe to return to the surface. According to the Hopi emergence tradition, humanity eventually came into the present world through the Sipapu, a sacred opening that marked the transition from the underground world to the one we know today. What makes these traditions especially interesting is that they describe the underground world as a real place rather than a symbolic one. The stories speak of chambers beneath the land, long migrations through underground passages, and guides who already knew those hidden places before the Hopi ancestors arrived. To the Hopi, these accounts were part of their history and identity, not simply stories created for entertainment. Anthropologists have generally studied them as elements of Hopi cosmology and religious tradition, while many Hopi continue to regard them as sacred teachings. Then there are the descriptions of the beings themselves. Different versions of the tradition contain different details, but some themes appear repeatedly. Several accounts describe them as larger than ordinary people. Others remember them as being covered in hair, and nearly all agree that they belong to the underground world beneath the canyon, rather than the villages built later on the mesas. By themselves, these traditions would simply be an important part of Hopi cultural history. But when placed beside the Arizona Gazette story, the similarities become difficult to ignore. A newspaper describes hidden chambers deep inside the Grand Canyon. The Hopi describe an underground world beneath the canyon. The newspaper reports preserved remains and unexplored passageways. The Hopi remember ancient beings who lived below the surface long before the present age. None of those parallels prove that the newspaper story was true. They do not prove that the cave existed exactly as it was described, but they do raise an important historical question. Could two completely different sources, one a newspaper published in 1909 and the other an oral tradition preserved for generations before that, be pointing toward the same place? That question becomes even more intriguing when we look at the canyon itself, because the Grand Canyon is not a single open valley. It is a landscape filled with extensive natural cave systems, especially within the Redwall limestone formation. Many sections remain extremely difficult to access, and even today large portions of the canyon's cliffs and cave networks have never been comprehensively explored. Perhaps that explains why this story has survived for so long. Not because anyone has proven what lies beneath the canyon, but because no one has completely answered the question either. And more than a century after the Arizona Gazette published its extraordinary report, the Grand Canyon still keeps its deepest places remarkably well hidden. More than a century has passed since the Arizona Gazette published its remarkable story. During those years, books have been written about the Grand Canyon. Millions of visitors have stood along its rim, looking down into one of the most studied landscapes on Earth. Geologists have spent decades examining its rock layers. Archaeologists have documented villages, trails, and artifacts left by the many indigenous peoples who have called this region home. Yet, despite all of that work, the story published in April 1909 has never completely disappeared. It continues to return because it asks a question that has never been answered in a way that satisfies everyone. If the article described a genuine expedition, where are the photographs, field notes, and recovered artifacts? If it was simply an elaborate newspaper story, why was it written with such remarkable detail, including measurements of chambers, descriptions of artifacts, and references to locations that remain difficult to reach even today? History has not provided a definitive answer. Instead, it has left us with fragments, a newspaper account, a Smithsonian denial, a canyon filled with thousands of caves, and an indigenous tradition that had been preserved for generations before the newspaper was ever printed. The Grand Canyon itself adds another layer to the mystery. Most visitors experience only the rim, looking down across an immense landscape carved by the Colorado River. But beneath those towering cliffs lies an intricate world of natural caves. Hidden ledges, narrow passages, and rock formations created over millions of years. The Redwall limestone alone contains extensive cave systems, many of which remain inaccessible without specialized climbing or river expeditions. Even today, much of that underground landscape has never been fully explored or mapped in detail. That does not prove the cave described in 1909 exists, but it does remind us that the canyon is far larger and far more complex than most people imagine. Then there is the Hopi perspective. In the year 2000, the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office issued a statement concerning sacred places within the Grand Canyon. Rather than encouraging further exploration, the statement emphasized that certain locations inside the canyon are spiritually significant and are not appropriate for public investigation. It did not confirm the Arizona Gazette story, nor did it attempt to validate every claim connected to it. Instead, it asked for respect. That distinction matters because throughout this documentary, we have looked at three very different kinds of evidence: a newspaper report, archaeological and geological knowledge about the canyon, and an oral tradition that has been carefully preserved within Hopi culture for generations. Each tells part of the story. None of them by themselves settles the question. History is rarely that simple. Sometimes a discovery answers old questions. Sometimes it creates entirely new ones. The Grand Canyon has done both. It has revealed civilizations, villages, trails, and sacred places that have transformed our understanding of the American Southwest. At the same time, it continues to go places that remain beyond easy reach. Perhaps one day new technology, whether high-resolution LiDAR, advanced cave mapping, or future archaeological surveys, will provide evidence that finally settles the mystery raised in 1909. Or perhaps the answer has never been hidden inside the canyon at all. Perhaps it has always existed in the stories of the people who knew this landscape long before newspapers, government surveys, or national parks. The Hopi have never claimed to possess every answer. What they have preserved is a memory of emerging from beneath the earth, a memory of underground chambers, and a memory of unusual beings who were already there when the ancestors began their journey into the present world. Whether those accounts describe literal history, sacred tradition, or a mixture of both is something each generation continues to debate. What cannot be debated is that these traditions have survived for centuries. Longer than the newspaper, longer than the modern state of Arizona, and far longer than any investigation into the 1909 expedition. Perhaps that is why the Grand Canyon continues to fascinate us. Not because every mystery has been solved, but because every generation returns to the same cliffs and asks the same question. What, if anything, still lies hidden beneath them? Thank you for watching. If you enjoy documentaries that explore forgotten history through historical records, archaeology, indigenous traditions, and original source material, consider subscribing for more investigations like this. And before you go, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you think the Hopi traditions and the 1909 Grand Canyon story are completely unrelated? Or could they preserve different memories of the same place? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next documentary.